Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Omar Siri, and I'm a research assistant in the Middle East and North Africa program here at Chatham House. I focus on Iraq and the Gulf countries with my colleague Jane Kinmont, who's also joining us here on the panel, for the launch of a program report entitled Iraq on the International Stage, Foreign Policy and National Identity in Transition. It is a culmination of a one-year research project funded by the U.S. Institute of Peace, looking at the foreign policy dynamics emerging in the new Iraq, 10 years after the US-led invasion and occupation of the country. Joining us here is it's a pleasure and it's an honor to welcome a full panel here tonight. First, let me introduce from my far left, Jane Kinmont, who is a senior research fellow here at Chatham House in the Middle East and North Africa program. Jane has been with Chatham House for 2 years and has been covering the Middle East and North Africa for more than a decade. And I would say perhaps encompassing best the international relations of the Middle East is her focus. To my far right is Professor Gareth Stansfield, who is a professor at the University of Exeter and is a professor of Middle East politics and the Al-Qasimi Chair of Arab Gulf Studies, where he is also the director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. Gareth is a dear friend to Chatham House. He was an associate fellow in the Middle East and North Africa program here at Chatham House for a decade. His latest work, latest article on Iraq is entitled The Unraveling of the Post-First World War State System, the Kurdistan, the Kurdistan region of Iraq and the transformation of the Middle East. To my left here is Dr. Phoebe Marr, who is a historian of modern Iraq and who is now retired, but was a research professor at the National Defense University and a professor of history at the University of Tennessee and Stanislaus State University in California. And her seminal work, I would say, is the Modern History of Iraq, which the third edition was published in 2011. And finally, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Ghanem El-Jumaili, who is the current Iraqi ambassador to Saudi Arabia, visiting us from Riyadh for this occasion. He has been the ambassador in Riyadh since March of 2009. Previous to that, he was the Iraqi ambassador to Japan since appointed in 2004. Prior to his appointment, perhaps most importantly to you, Ambassador, you served as CEO of Life for Relief and Development, a Michigan-based charity credited with helping Iraqi families during the post-Gulf War I period. I should note he has also worked for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, where he worked specifically on the Mars Pathfinder Land Rover. And I should note as well that I had the privilege of having a one-on-one conversation with him yesterday about politics in Iraq, where he referred to one issue as saying, "It's not rocket science," which obviously meant a lot coming from him. So I will start. We have a full panel, as I mentioned, so I'll start with passing it over to Gareth Stansfield to set the scene for this project and introduce some of the findings of the paper and the report. Gareth.
Thank you, Omar. I'd just like to, I've just realized with Phoebe here, I think I owe you a big thanks because Phoebe gave me my first opportunity ever to engage with a policy community back when I was in my earlier years, significantly earlier years, by inviting me over to Washington just before the Iraq War. So it's very nice to be sharing a panel with you at this point. I'm going to introduce the project and why we thought that this was a good idea to pitch to the US Institute of Peace. In the Middle East program, we were batting around for some time what Iraq was in terms of its position in the state system in the Middle East, particularly from 2003 onwards. If we look at the historical literature on Iraq, we see a very powerful, if unpredictable state, whether it's under the military regimes or under Saddam later on, but one that is very actively engaged in the dynamics of the region, in foreign policy, however we wish to define that. We can certainly look towards Iraq's engagement in the Gulf in the 80s, its engagement with Iran, its invasion of Kuwait. It's all being examples of its position in foreign relations. And particularly with regard to Gulf security, we could not talk about the security of the Gulf in the 1970s, 1980s, without considering the position of Iraq and what Baghdad was doing or thinking or may do. But then we get to the question of the 1990s and where was Iraq in terms of foreign policy, international relations. And of course, Iraq was under sanctions. Iraq had a very limited ability to engage in foreign policy in a meaningful sense, let alone be a partner in regional initiatives. And in some ways, it became frozen in the 1990s. 2003 gave us the opportunity, or the years after 2003 gave us the opportunity to start reconsidering Iraq again and whether it would retake its previous position of being a heavyweight in terms of how we consider Persian Gulf security, to consider whether it would have different sorts of engagement in the Middle East region, whether it would be resurrected, rehabilitated within the international community as well. And so we started questioning these ideas significantly within the program. And we became particularly interested in the fact that Iraq was seen, more often than not, when we were talking about Iraq's foreign policy and foreign relations, we weren't really talking about that. We started focusing more and more upon what other countries were doing in Iraq. Iraq was far more a subject of other states' foreign policies and national interests, with seemingly little leverage to engage and promote its own national interests in the post-2003 period. However, we thought that we would try and get ahead of that particular curve, and after certainly the elections of 2005, the Constitution of 2005, and from 2000 and after the Civil War ended, we started to think about looking at Iraq as a more meaningful foreign policy actor. And so we presented a proposal that considered, that would try to look at Iraq's national interests, look at the foreign policy architecture and infrastructure of the Iraqi state going forward under Nouri al-Maliki, and look at whether what we see in Iraq today maps onto what academics in the 90s in particular were talking about in Iraq under Saddam, and whether Iraq was indeed now a foreign policy actor in a sovereign sense capable of projecting its interests, or whether it did remain an object. Previous Chatham House papers have talked about Iraq being a vortex, a place in which other national interests had been sucked into. And it was very difficult to get away from that idea, of course. We were working in the post-Civil War period, in what we started to call the post-American period, although we backed away from using that language quite quickly. And instead, we started to look at Iraq as a penetrated state, one again in which, even though Iraqi politicians and actors were trying to project a unified picture of Iraqi nationalism and Iraqi interests, we still could not get away from Iraq being a theater for the activities of neighboring powers, and especially Iran, Turkey and Gulf states in particular, and of course, Western powers as well. Very quickly, we have, first of all, we struggled to try and pull away from the questions of Iraqi national identity, of sectarianism, of communalism, and we realized that was very much a futile endeavor. The more that we started to try and talk about what is Iraq's foreign policy, the more we realized that perhaps there isn't such a thing as the singular Iraq foreign policy. And so we started trying to think through, well, what are Iraq's multiple foreign policies, trying to problematize it in that sort of way, which didn't really work either. We then hit upon the idea that rather than talking about foreign policy, we should be considering Iraqis' foreign relations. So Iraq does not have foreign policy per se. Iraqis engage in foreign relations. And that was a much more productive way forward of considering the Iraqi state and what was happening. And that does not map onto the previous literature. Charles Tripp in the 1990s, writing about the foreign policy of Iraq under Saddam, talked about foreign policy stopping at the gates of the presidential palace. Basically, everything outside the singular presidential palace of Saddam, including everything in Iraq outside the presidential palace, was in fact considered foreign policy. It was very tightly controlled. It was also very expansive within that sort of definition. What we started to consider was Iraq had a range of presidential policies post-2003, and these still remain in place. We found that there wasn't one singular focal point of Iraqi foreign policy, although foreign policy for Iraq is controlled heavily by the Prime Minister, by Nouri al-Maliki, but there are equally very heavy centers of foreign policy activity and foreign relations control from other political parties, other regions, other social or political organizations that can all have the ability to engage in foreign relations as not quite equal weights to the Prime Minister, but sometimes very, very powerful. And we can talk about the different political parties. A focus for us especially was the rise of the Kurdistan regional government that does not have a formalized foreign policy, but you can certainly see a whole series of de facto foreign relations. So we're making a what we thought would be a relatively simple project was becoming very, very complicated very quickly. With that framework, we struggled to get away from the salience of sectarianism and ethnicity and communal politics. And indeed, we've just had a roundtable discussion where we failed to get away from it yet again. And very quickly, we would find our discussions in Washington, in London, the interviews that we were having, would focus very heavily on domestic politics, upon the balances of power between Sunnis and Shias and Kurds and Turkmens and Christians, and the relationships that subnational or communal groups would be constructing with their neighbors around them. And that, in effect, was constituting the foreign policy or foreign relations debate of Iraq. The interests of communities, the domestic interests of communities, whether articulated in terms of security, economy, whatever, would be used as the basis for foreign engagement. And this has a place within the international relations and foreign policy analysis literature. It's known as omni-balancing, the balancing of domestic concerns with foreign relations engagement. And it seemed to apply very neatly to what we were talking about in Iraq. But again, it created a very complex picture for us that we were, in effect, we were disproving the hypothesis that we posed in the original application, that Iraq does have a foreign policy going forward. It's sovereign, it has elections, it has a coherent government, but we could not identify beyond certain national interests that are geographically determined. We could not identify Iraq's national interests, foreign policy interests, and see them being carried through a formal structure to implementation. During this time, the events in Syria grew up and became a very useful, of course, very tragic case study for us to then understand how Iraq or Iraqis responded to the very serious foreign policy challenges that were occurring to the West. And Syria exposes the cleavages amongst Iraqi political elites, amongst different interests, and the way that the wider regional politics, whether the national interests of regional states, whether the sectarian dimension that seems to be so powerful now in the Middle East, how they mapped onto Iraq and seemed to pull different interests apart. Jane will be talking a little bit in some more detail about the contestation between Baghdad, or particularly between Nouri al-Maliki's circle. As we discussed earlier in our round table, we're not talking about Shia politics here, we're talking about the foreign policy of the Prime Minister compared to the foreign policy of, or the foreign relations of Sunni Arab associated groups. I was particularly interested in Kurdistan's position with regard to Syria and also with regard to Turkey, which is why I wrote a provocatively titled piece called The Unraveling of the Middle East State System, ? Kurdistan has emerged over a decade now as an autonomous entity in Iraq, but one that increasingly does have the ability to project itself as a foreign policy actor. And certainly in the case of Syria, it seems to be doing that with a degree of, to a noticeable degree, if to varying degrees of success. Its engagement in Turkey with being part of the PKK negotiations, and mediations are very clear. And the Iraqi Kurds' engagement in wider Middle East political events has become very noticeable indeed. So Kurdistan is an autonomous actor pursuing a foreign policy of its own design, but within a sovereign framework of Iraq, raises all sorts of issues, interesting theoretical, practical questions, and also questions for Iraq's integrity going forward. At that point, I think I'll hand over to Jane, but I would just ask you to keep in mind this phrase that we thought was quite clever, that we started off trying to find Iraq's foreign policy, Iraq's national interests. Instead, we found Iraqis engaging in foreign relations, often in a very reactive sort of way, rather than a proactive charting out of the problems and issues ahead, but instead, far more reactive approach from Iraqis of different identities, ethnicities, sectarian associations or political affiliations, focused upon the game of domestic politics back home. And with that in mind, foreign relations still remained very much a domestic, local political game. Jane.
Thank you very much, Gareth. When we spoke to various officials at Iraq's foreign ministry about the direction of Iraq's foreign policy since 2003, they told us that the overarching concern of the past decade had been to restore the country's sovereignty, specifically to negotiate an end to the US-led military occupation, and also to get Iraq out of the multiple sanctions that it faced under the UN's Chapter 7, most of which have finally been lifted last month, but still not 100%. We wanted to situate the study in the context of Iraq still undergoing a process of post-colonial state formation, being a country that only emerged from occupation a couple of years ago, and a country that has been having to rebuild its state institutions over the course of the last decade. So it's really at the sharp end of the problems that are faced to some extent by the region as a whole, which has for a long time been dependent on the security protections given by great powers from beyond the region, and where you see a mounting sense of insecurity around the perception that the US might be pulling back from the region as a whole. I don't know whether that's true. There have been people arguing that the US role in the Middle East and in the world is in decline for at least 30 years, but it's certainly a perception that's out there now. And we see, particularly over Syria, a tendency to expect and to rely on US leadership and US intervention, even if people often resent it when it happens. That expectation is there, and Iraq has been at the sharp end of it. Another priority for the Iraqi government, which has been led particularly by the executive, by the Prime Minister's office, has been to balance two key strategic relationships, namely those with the US and with Iran. And it's certainly not an easy position to be in when your two main allies are generally confronting each other in a host of areas across the region. Iraq is in the rare position of being friends with both in a Middle East that is increasingly polarized between a pro-US camp, most of which happens to be Sunni Muslim, and a pro-Iranian camp. But there has been an ability to accommodate both powers to some extent. Indeed, to such an extent that there is a conspiracy theory in parts of the region suggesting that the US-Iran enmity is all a facade, and that in fact they are very good friends, and that this is proven by their cooperation in Iraq. Given the need to balance between these great powers, we heard from a variety of Iraqi politicians, including from the Prime Minister's Dawa party, the view that Iraq's foreign policy should be a policy of regional non-alignment. Their view as expressed to us and as expressed in their foreign policy strategy documents is that being part of Axis didn't serve Iraq well under Saddam, that the country has got in enough foreign policy misadventures, and that given its domestic diversity, it's better pursuing a third way, a policy of neutrality. In a region where there are not many countries with such a policy, perhaps Oman is a rare example. But this articulated policy is an incredibly long way away from the perception of Iraq's foreign policy by most of the other countries in the region. It is generally identified by most of its regional peers as being in a pro-Iranian camp, as being profoundly subjected to Iranian influence, at least under the current Iraqi government. And while Iraq has been trying to work to restore its sovereignty, its neighbours and its regional peers still have not really come to regard it as fully sovereign since 2003. Foreign relations remain profoundly affected by non-state actors who typically seek foreign alliances and sometimes promise foreign countries that they would rebalance Iraq's foreign relations if only they could get support for their domestic power bids. Relevant here too is the legacy of the way that the regime change happened. There are good reasons why Iraqi politicians might believe that foreign support is instrumental and valuable when it comes to gaining power. We also found that Iraq's foreign relations are deeply influenced by the country's domestic politics. Rather like Egypt, Iraq is a large, culturally significant and religiously significant country that's always had influence that has reverberated beyond its borders. Many of the political movements across the Middle East in the 20th century were centered in Iraq, whether you're looking at religious movements or the Communist Party. And even when Iraq is not deliberately trying to project itself as a foreign policy actor, other countries have a lot of interest in what happens within the country. And of course, other powers in the region have had concerns, whether they relate to the possible domino effect of democracy or relating to the potential for the empowerment of Shia and Kurdish parties to embolden counterparts elsewhere in the region. Also, perceptions of the nature of political and sectarian exclusion within Iraq itself have been very detrimental to its attempts to build relations with some of its neighbouring states, especially in the Gulf. As Gareth mentioned, there's not been a great deal of focus on Iraq as a foreign policy actor in recent years. When we started to tell people about the title of our survey, many were surprised and asked why we were studying this. But more recently, Iraq's foreign policy has come more into the international spotlight over Syria. Unfortunately, the most difficult and domestically divisive issue it's faced. And this has really come into the media attention owing to issues like the US expressing concern about Iranian overflights through Iraqi territory and reports of, again, the non-state actors, Iraqi militias getting involved in the Syrian conflict on both sides. As Iraq's foreign minister has been noting in recent interviews, the country's official foreign policy towards Syria is to be neutral, but that's something that is increasingly difficult. And again, Syria has reinforced the sense of many other countries in the region that Iraq is in a pro-Iranian camp. The situation, as seen by a diverse range of Iraqi politicians, is a lot more complex and a lot more nuanced. There's been historically no love lost between the Iraqi government and Assad. If we go back a few years, the Iraqi government was desperately seeking international pressure on Bashar Assad because they saw him allowing and facilitating the movement of, at the time, largely Sunni jihadis into Iraq to carry out suicide bombings there. At that time, the fashion in the West was for engaging with Assad, the young reformer, and Iraq got limited help and attention at the time. However, among the Iraqi ruling party, it seems there's a huge fear of the alternative in Syria, that they see only the possibility of, they see the only possible alternative to the current regime as being a hostile Sunni Islamist government. And ironically, the more Iraq is seen as backing the Syrian government, the more likely it is that that would become a self-fulfilling prophecy that a future government in Syria would be hostile to Iraq. The concerns are understandable, but at the same time, the lack of a plan B and the lack of a preparation for what happens if the regime does change is something very concerning. Iraqi interviewees also expressed to us the sense of there being important differences of interests between Iraq and Iran, including when it comes to religion and the traditional rivalry between Najaf and Qom as centers of Islamic thought, and increasingly over oil policy, something that may become more of an issue when Iraq eventually rejoins the OPEC quota system. But already Iraq has overtaken Iran as an oil producer. The economic weight between the two countries is shifting as Iran's oil sector is squeezed by sanctions, while Iraq's oil sector finally moves ahead. And there are serious questions about whether Iran can really rely on Iraq remaining a junior partner as it becomes the wealthier partner. But again, this sense of there being few options recurred. We heard from many people the sense that it was not necessarily healthy for Iraq to be aligned with Iran, that it would make sense to have more of a balance with the other Gulf states. But from their viewpoint, the doors of many other Arab Sunni countries in the region had not been open to them. At the same time, when you compare different relationships with different Gulf states, notably Iraq's progress in relations with Kuwait, despite the bitter history between the two countries, it's clear that there are other options. It's also clear from the progress that's been made in the relationship between Turkey and the Kurdistan regional government that politics and foreign relations don't only have to be defined by historical identity-based rivalries, and that economic and trade cooperation can provide ways of moving beyond that zero-sum outlook. We also found it interesting that when we talked to people about relations beyond the region, the idea of national consensus and national interest became clearer. For instance, looking towards Asia. It's forecast by the International Energy Agency that by 2035, 80% of Iraq's oil exports will be going to China. In many ways, Iraq has a lot of interests in common with the Gulf oil exporters of the region, in that in the long term, it makes sense for it to diversify its alliances away from the US and away from the West, and to build more links with emerging Asian powers. Crucially, powers such as India and China also want to take a non-aligned role in the Middle East. They want to be buying oil from both Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they don't want to be making many enemies. And those ambitions could fit well with some of Iraq's. But these areas where there are more consensus certainly aren't the preoccupation of policymakers, and most of the discussions remained preoccupied with the divisive and fear-inducing issues closer to home. I'll conclude there, but very happy to answer questions at any point later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I will turn it over to Phoebe. I should mention that we will be having a question and answer period after the panelists have spoken, but I will turn it over to Phoebe for her comments.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Chatham House and especially Jane and Gareth for being here and seeing so many old friends. It's a wonderful opportunity. And I'd also like to congratulate them for a wonderful report, which it's very difficult to add to, and I find myself almost entirely in agreement with it. So I'm going to, I should also mention that in addition to my academic background, I spent about 12 or 15 years working for the US government in an analyst position, but also one which gave me plenty of opportunity to see how difficult it is in the United States to formulate foreign policy and to execute it. So in a way, what we're describing about Iraq could be equally said about America. It's very complex and very difficult, and I'm of the opinion that all politics is domestic. So I would like to, as an outsider, somebody who's retired now, assure you that I'm not speaking for the US government. I cannot do that, but I'm certainly very aware of policy developments, and so I'm going to kind of reflect how Iraqi policy looks in Washington and from Washington's perspective. I'd like to add a little bit to what Gareth and Jane have said to say as a historian of modern Iraq, that Iraq has always had a difficulty, modern Iraq, in dealing with its neighbors. It has a particularly difficult problem. It's got 6 different neighbors, often with very different geostrategic and even cultural orientations. It's got 2 neighbors, very important neighbors on the Gulf, looking to the Gulf. It's got 2 on the Levant, and then it's got 2 sort of regional superpowers to deal with as well. 4 of those countries are Arab, and the 2 sort of non-Arab countries are large and very dominant. So there has never been a time when there hasn't been quite an intertwining between Iraq's population, which of course straddles these borders, and relations with these neighbors. We're more familiar with the strong Iraq, which certainly did have a single voice, to say the least, under Saddam, which caused no end of problems. Now we're dealing with a much weaker Iraq, and hence the impact of the regional neighbors is much stronger, and what Iraq would say is meddling of foreigners in their policy, and likewise looking to neighbors by different groups within Iraq can be acute. And I do agree with the general idea that it is difficult. Iraq doesn't have a single, clearly explicit foreign policy that represents yet the Iraqi state. That is perhaps why I think the term relations is probably very good, but a former Iraqi ambassador to the US said something I think is worth paying attention to, that in dealing with these neighbors, it doesn't make sense for Iraq to have a single regional strategy. You know, one size fits all. That wouldn't make any sense in any event. In fact, they are striving a little bit more to have bilateral relations, and hence I think this whole idea of relations is a very good one. And indeed, it seems to me that they probably have a better chance of accomplishing some of their objectives in that way. So we all know that it's very important for them to be dealing with Iran, and certainly balancing Iran and the US, but also they're attempting, as far as I can understand, to deal with their long-standing contentious border issues with Iran. And that has been mentioned, so we don't get too tied down by negativity. There are long-standing issues with Kuwait, to say the least. And that's certainly, that particular relationship bilaterally now seems to be certainly doing very well, and a positive outcome of the bilateral relationship. But Syria remains a very difficult problem, particularly because of the spillover of these domestic relations. Now, I want to reflect on how Iraq policy looks in the United States, and several things, as a very close observer of that, several things actually strike me there, which is very much in tune with the gist of this report. And this may be quite tactical, which I think Iraq is. It's not yet strategic. It can't take a strategic point of view, despite the fact that some of the interests that have been pointed out are interests in the plural are clear. Relations in Washington by the Iraqis are carried out, I would say, on a triangular basis. All key relationships, as far as I can see, between the United States and Iraq, and vice versa, the key ones, particularly on security, which is paramount. Not only achieving sovereignty, but developing capacity to achieve it, is carried out through the Prime Minister's office, through Maliki's office directly. It's direct, and relationships are highly personal. In that regard, most of the effort on the American side is carried out by the White House, so to speak, by the NSC, which has the essential Iraqi file. We, of course, have an ambassador in Baghdad, and that relationship seems to be doing pretty well. I don't know, because Secretary of State Kerry is new. Some of that relationship may shift a bit out of the White House in Obama's second term over to Kerry. But this is done on a direct relationship under Maliki and Maliki's staff. We, apparently, the people who are conducting this, do have very good access, very good relations. They do get in to talk to him, but they do this directly. They may pick up the phone, they may go very frequently. And that is why, when I'm listening to the array of opinions on Iraq that one inevitably hears in Washington, including a lot of difference, including from people inside our own government, the folks who are dealing directly with Maliki tend to have a more positive point of view on how things are going, how relations are going, and so on, because they have the direct access. And vice versa. When Maliki or the government wants to, got something to say or conduct business, he often sends his people directly to Washington, particularly, for example, Fayyad and so on. So it's personal. It hasn't yet been institutionalized. It's still very direct. Now, how about, and that's particularly with respect to security, how about the rest of Iraq's relationship with the United States? I would say there are sort of two arms to that. One I'll mention more briefly in passing, how they, and that is the office in New York, of course, the Iraqi office in New York, whose direct job is to deal with the United States. And I would say, in a sense, the rest of the international community. Iraq has had a very good ambassador there. We have a new one, so I don't know what the relationship is, but I don't myself see too much connection between the New York office and Washington, although they may be more than I see. And apparently that's gone very well because, again, I will mention the recent UN action in removing most, if not all, of the Chapter 7 requirements from Iraq. Now, the rest of the relations between Iraq and the United States, I want to dwell on because I have some thoughts on how that could be improved. That is from the Iraqi embassy in Washington, which I do follow fairly closely. And it needs to progress. This indicates very well that Iraqi foreign policy, Iraqi staffing has not yet been institutionalized. And when I want to understand Iraq and Iraqi politics, I sort of look at that because I have relationships with the people. I hear what they say to one another, not just what they say to the Americans. And it does strike me as a little microcosm of what's happening in Baghdad. Now, what does this mean? What this means, frankly, is that the staff, again, is relying almost wholly by this direct relationship between Maliki and the United States. And it needs much more work on outreach to America, because America is extraordinarily difficult. Very many Americans can't understand how our policy is made and carried out, and it's even more difficult for most foreigners, to say nothing of a new regime like Iraq, which now doesn't have as many people educated in the West, familiar with the West, or at least the United States. I can't speak for everyone. It really has to kind of learn the ropes. It's not good enough to just deal with the White House or even the State Department. You have to get out to Congress. You have to sort of work that area. You have to work with the media. You have to have some kind of outreach there. You certainly need to work with think tanks, like Chatham House and others here. There's an array of think tanks now in Washington. They do have some influence. They have influence in public. They have influence in the White House. They help shape thinking. As Iraq moves forward, it needs to develop both breadth and depth. And incidentally, it also needs to get out of Washington and influence other areas, other people, especially congressional offices elsewhere, which can play a role back in Washington. And this will help develop not only better Iraqi understanding of the US, but something that is really necessary, and that is better relations with the press, a better image for Iraq in the United States, so that when I pick up the newspaper, the only time I see anything on Iraq, as you said this afternoon, Omar, is how many people died. I want some good news stories, and there are some good news stories. I want to see something that's going to help influence the United States. Right now, what Iraq has done with this kind of relationship is two things. First of all, they are working through the Iraqi American community. Now, as it is in London, that is a very large and a very rich community. I do not mean wealthy. Many of them are wealthy. They've done very well. But it is a rich resource for Iraq and for the Americans all over the United States. I'm very impressed with them. They are institutionalized. They are in all kinds of institutions, academia, business. We've just heard about a good example here. Well, that's very good, but you're not alone, as you very well know. And so, as far from being opposed to using that resource, and they're pretty pro-Iraqi, that group. They certainly want to improve relations. They're in a good position to do that. So it's not, it's a very wise thing to do. But it's necessary, but not sufficient. To really influence and impact policy, there needs to be a much broader base established in the United States, as I have said. Iraq has recently also hired a PR firm to handle a lot of this, the Podesto firm, which does have extremely close relationships with Obama. So that's another way in which they're attempting to influence. But again, that's not sufficient. Obama will be there for another 3 years, and after that, hopefully Iraq will institutionalize. And it's also very useful to mention here, I think, or significant to mention, that what has been said about Iraq not having one policy, but maybe, not policy, but relations, several. And an indication of this is the fact that Iraq is not the only representative of the Iraqi embassy, is not the only representative of the Iraqis in Washington. It has a very vigorous, very strong Kurdish, KRG representation, which is a virtual embassy in almost all but name. The Kurds have been very successful here. One reason for that is that many Kurdish representatives have been in Washington for years. They do have their own agenda, and they have done much of what I've suggested. They've got representatives in Congress. There's a Friends of Kurdistan group of congressional leaders. They certainly have ties with the press, and so on, and so forth. But this is a little indication and a little reflection of you know, the whole situation. Baghdad, I think, when I ask, wants two things from the United States, and is done a great deal, at least in trying to get this. One is the business community. They would like investment. The whole oil issue is very important, as we know, but I'm not referring to oil. I'm referring to small business investment, which would give them a boost, which would establish a stake by Americans in Iraq, which would, of course, establish economic links and ties with the private sector, very important. And second, education. Iraq now has a program to send ultimately thousands of students to the United States, and undoubtedly also here to England and elsewhere. That I consider to be very, very important for the future. That is another stake, another very important link and tie for the future. And I hope that a little more effort will be done, of course, by the Americans, but also by the Iraqis in nurturing those people coming to make sure that the experience is successful and a good one. And of course, that they go back and work in Iraq. So there are these links and ties. The Americans also have to do a great deal more, but my job is to talk about the Iraqis. I want to make one final point and comment, and that is that in general, Iraqis, you can see that in Washington, are going through what I'm going to call a withdrawal syndrome. And that has got a little history. Iraq got such unbelievable personal attention under Bush, particularly in the beginning of this occupation. I've never seen anything quite like it. It was not only that we had troops, it was not only that we had spent money. I could give you the figures, but you're probably all aware of them. But I think what Iraqis and many other Middle Easterners don't appreciate was the amount of personnel and oxygen that sucked out of American policy. Americans do have to worry about the rest of the world, the rest of the Middle East, and so on. It just obliterated everything else. Now, that, of course, has changed. The change was gradual as we began to withdraw, and of course, as Obama got elected on a very different platform than Bush, and it's now complete with the final withdrawal of troops. And if you talk to the Obama administration officials, they will tell you that we have a new relationship with Iraq. Iraq is now a normal country, and we're going to relate to it diplomatically and in other ways as a normal country. But the truth of the matter is that in some areas that looks like neglect, particularly compared with the previous attention. It looks like we're not paying attention. I myself sometimes ask that question, but we are paying some attention. It's just that we're not paying very much attention, particularly compared with the past. Some in Iraq many perhaps are very worried, especially the Kurds, which would like a stronger relationship. This has led to, as I say, a sort of withdrawal syndrome. It's not very good on the American side either. I'm not here to discuss that, but our ability to get information, understanding, contact people in Baghdad, in my view, is a real problem, which we can't go into here. But the Iraqis need to compensate a bit and understand, I think, that they're going to have to and can do it. They'll find a welcoming atmosphere in the United States, and they need to fill that in Washington. So that's about where I see it at the moment. And both sides, the United States and Iraq, do need to make an effort to sort of fill in a little bit of that gap on the withdrawal issue.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. Last but not least, I will turn to Ambassador Jumaili for his comments.
Thank you very much, Omar. I'd like to start by thanking Chatham House for the great invitation, and it's a great honor for me to sit in front of, with such a distinguished panel and distinguished audience here. I have to start by saying that these are personal remarks and don't reflect the views of the ministry whom I'm proud of. But these are personal notes. And in thinking about Iraq's foreign policy, I'm reminded by a meeting I had once with Ambassador Lakhdar al-Ibrahimi. We were talking about Iraq, and he said, everything about Iraq that when we started working in Iraq seemed like trying to tie your shoelace while running. I said, Your Excellency, if I can add to that, running for your life. And indeed, it seems, so many things seems from the outside seems to be very simple because of the complexity of the situation that we've encountered in Iraq. Even the simple seems sometimes a tall task. This is not asking for an excuse on our shortcomings. I'm the first one to admit that we have a lot of shortcomings in this. Second thing, I'd like to start by acknowledging and congratulating Iraq on the recent advancement related to the Chapter 7 removal. This is a great accomplishment, and we hope that more things to come in this regard, especially with Iraq's relation with the international community and with its neighbors. However, as a practitioner, I have to caution myself and my fellow Iraqis and our Iraqis friends throughout the world that something like this should not be part of what is called in the media Iraq's fatigue. We have to stress the partnership between Iraq and the international community. Iraq needs the international community's involvement on many issues, important issues in the rebuilding and reconstruction of Iraq. So the engagement of the international community in Iraq is vital for us. The second thing I'd like to mention here is last night, Iraqi football team qualified for the round 8 in the international football under 20. Unfortunately, that happened on the account of England, so we had to kick England out, but we had to do it. But anyway, the reason I'm mentioning this is because every time the Iraqi national team plays, we see the strong sentiment of nationalism among the Iraqi community. The Iraqis, regardless of their background, regardless of their sect, they really root to their team because it's one of the symbols that are left that represent the true Iraq, and that allows the strength of nationalism in the Iraqis to emerge in sometimes these difficult environments. And that's something that I want to stress, is the depth of Iraqi nationalism. I think any other country that would have been exposed to what the Iraqis have been exposed to would have fractured long ago. But what kept Iraq together is the sense, the deep sense of nationalism. In relating to foreign policy in my simple approach requires two important elements. The first one is a clear identification of national interests. And the second one is institutional building that seeks to achieve those national interests. National interest offers two important opportunities for us. Number one is rallying the Iraqi community, the Iraqi people, around these interests, because these are the ligament that brings the Iraqis together is the pursuit of national interests. It's the knowledge that by being together, okay, the total, the whole is much bigger than the pieces. And it's in the interest of everybody to stick together because the whole, like I said, is much bigger than the pieces. That's the opportunity that offers national interest. The other one is it provides the common language in our approach to the rest of the world. That's the language we have to speak. Because everybody now, when we talk to other countries, and they question motivations. No, if there is a clarity in terms of this national interest, then they become the platform and the common language that we strike with the rest of the world and especially our neighbors. Currently, Iraq is confronted with tremendous challenges on the international scene. Some of these challenges, what I call legacy issues, things we inherited from the previous regime. And the previous regime, if it was good in anything, it was good in creating enemies. And they did that. And now we have to accept that challenge, and we have to understand the deep roots and causes of those efforts and try to address them. It's something that we have to come to acknowledge and try to clear. We have, as example, our relationship with our neighbors, Iran, because of the long war and legacy of that, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. And I'm reminded in Saudi Arabia by places where the missiles, the Scud missiles fell on Riyadh and other places. So this is vivid memory. And every time I go visit my friends in Kuwait, everything that is about the Iraq's invasion. So we as Iraqis, we have to come to a realization about that, and we have to address these issues, and we have to present a new image of Iraq based on our realization of our national interests. Then there's new challenges that have emerged that we have to really rise up to and provide. We have to work on issues like these. Issues like the borders with our neighbors, and issues like important issue like water resources and sharing our vital water resources with our neighbors, especially Turkey, Syria, and Iran. And those are extremely important. Then we have the issues of border security and cross-border by non-state actors, especially like what happened in Iraq a few years ago and what might be happening, what is happening in the case of the Syrian issue. Energy policy. Energy policy is vital national interest for Iraq, a clear policy that uses Iraq's resources for the benefit of its people. But this also can be a platform of discussions and cooperation with our neighbor and the rest of the international community, especially like the previous speaker said about Asia and the need of Asia for the resources of Iraq. Then there are other whole host of issues that we have to work and we have to strive to achieve for the Iraqi people. Iraq, in trying to establish coherent foreign policy, we're not inventing the wheel right now. Iraqis have gone through this before. When Iraq emerged under the British colonialism in the late 20s and early 30s, was able, in a very short time, to establish a clear foreign policy that continued. And not only that, but it was able to build first-rate diplomatic corps. I'm really amazed when I read books by the old ambassadors, and I'm reading reports from Iraqi embassies in the 30s and 30s, 40s, and 50s about important issues in the region, whether it's the Gulf or Iraq-Saudi relations. So if Iraq was able to do that in a short period of time at that time, I'm confident that Iraq is even more capable to accomplish something like that in these days. I remain confident in the future of Iraq and its ability to rebuild itself with the help of our friends. I, again, will conclude by that and conclude by thanking the rest of the panelists who didn't leave much for me to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador.